All right, y'all, let's talk about the Confederate flag. One of the more controversial symbols of American culture. This flag represents a lot of things to many different people. You have one group of people who maybe, mainly reside in the South, maybe a minority, believe that this flag represents history, not hate. These people think that this is a flag built on Southern heritage. It represents Southern culture. It represents the Southern identity. This flag was used many times as a emblem and was incorporated into many state flags in the South. It just represents a Southern heritage of sorts. There's also the other side of the coin. Many people view this flag, and rightfully so, as a racist symbol from a bygone era, representing a government that was bound and formed on the basis of slavery, of racism, on the expansion of that wicked institution. Also, it's been used by other people to enforce racist policies and racist attitudes in society. The Confederate flag, as it would become called, was used by the Dixiecrats in the 60s. It's also been used by the KKK. So it's been seen as more of a symbol of racism in America. Interestingly enough, though, in this video, I'm going to talk about what this flag, kind of means to some people, also some of the history behind it, but also for the weird fact that this flag that's widely known and used by people to represent the Confederacy, especially during the American Civil War, was actually never their official flag, believe it or not. It was just a battle flag that was mainly widely used by the Confederate Armed Forces. Interestingly enough, it was never an official flag of the Confederacy. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the mess that was the Confederate States of America's official flags. I'll talk about some history behind them. Also talk about the battle flag, of course. Give you my thoughts on them from a purely flag design standpoint. I personally, though, don't like many of these flags on ideological grounds, just because all these flags represent a government that, in my opinion, was formed on the basis of slavery and to expand it. And honestly, I'm glad the Confederacy died as a result. But yeah, let's get into all these situations and the history behind the flags of the Confederate States of America. So let's talk about the first one. Now, the first flag that was adopted by the Confederates when the South tried to proclaim their independence from the North and form their own country that would be called the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy for short, they would adopt the flag in early 1861 called the Stars and Bars. Now, this was eventually called the first official national flag, nicknamed, I think, the Stars and Bars. And as you can see, its design is very similar to the United States flag. There's many attributes of this flag that were very similar to even American Revolutionary flags. It has a big, white bar to it, 2 red bars, and also a top left that has a blue symbol, blue section, just like the United States, with a kind of circle of stars. Now, it was originally released with 7 stars in early 1861, but by December 1861, it had 13 stars. Interestingly enough, the Confederacy did claim Kentucky and Missouri as part of their Confederacy, despite the fact that those situations in those border states, while they were slave states, it was much more complicated. Mostly the population was unionist. There's some situations like the Missouri government in particular, the governor wanted the state, tried to force the state to secede, even though, like I said, secessionists were really a minority in Missouri, and created a very weird situation. But that's for another video. Regardless, though, this was a very interesting flag. Apparently, to give you a little bit of background on it, when the South was seceding, they were obviously, trying to proclaim a new country. You need a new flag with that new country, right? And one of the first things that were created and, kind of organized from the newly formed Confederate Congress was a flag committee, which was actually chaired by someone by the name of William Porcher Miles, a very much fire eater, a secessionist Democrat from South Carolina. And he basically formed a committee to basically take requests, ideas, thoughts on the topic from the general public. Apparently, the committee was overwhelmed with requests to make the flag more similar to the American flag. And what resulted as this was the Stars and Bars flag. And this became what, the official flag of the Confederacy. It was actually the flag that was flown over Fort Sumter after it was bombarded and the Union garrison there surrendered. So kind of an interesting little fact there. But of course, this flag also created a lot of problems. And of course, if you just by the look of it, right, it looks very similar to the American flag. But that's not necessarily a good thing when you're trying to fight a war in the midst of a battlefield and proclaim your independence. This was actually a big problem with what became the Battle of Manassas, or the Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the Civil War. And that battle in general was just a giant confusion on all sides. There was not really a, uniformed look to both sides of the war. There was a mix, mash of blue troops fighting other blue troops in blue uniforms and all that kind of stuff, and different flags waved around. And especially in the midst of battle, the Stars and Bars looked very similar to the United States flag. And it created a lot of confusion, especially when units, especially when, like, from the headquarters down, right, these commanders were trying to move their troops and brigades. And from the distance, it's hard to tell what is actually their units and the American units. So this flag, became kind of unpopular by the soldiers of the Confederacy and eventually the Southern public in general, just because they thought the flag represented a, government that they were trying to leave from. Why are we having a flag so similar to that? And I totally agree with the criticisms. While I do think it's a pleasant looking flag and in a lot of ways is the better of the Confederate flags, as we will see, it is very too similar to United States flag. And it creates a big problem government-wise, ideology-wise, and of course just in simple appearance alone. So now we're going to move on to the next official flag, which is, of course, we're going to talk about the famous Confederate battle flag. Now, this is the flag that's widely used by Southerners and people who view this flag, and just in general, the Confederate side of the Civil War. And this, of course, would become the flag that's, the Confederate battle flag. Now, a flag that, this flag was kind of born out of the confusion and a lot of the military problems that resulted from the Stars and Stripes, the Stars and Bars that I already mentioned during the first Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. And there was calls, especially by the military, to create a flag at the very least to separate the forces and create a symbol that was just different from the United States flag in general. This actually came with General P.G.T. Beauregard, one of the big commanders of the Southern armies, after the Battle of Manassas. He was resolved to have the flag changed. And he actually, went to his aide, which was William Porcher Miles. I already mentioned him before. He was the former chairman and the guy that led the Confederate Congress Committee on the flag. And he actually designed a flag that was very similar to what became known as the Confederate battle flag. And he actually, this proposal was rejected because they decided to do the Stars and Bars. But he presented his rejected proposal to him. Beauregard liked it, and then eventually presented it apparently to Joseph E. Johnston. And, the basic general gist was that they were going to have kind of two flags. The battle flag was going to be used, which will, of course, become the one that everyone remembers, was going to be used in the midst of battle. And then the other idea was to have a peace flag, which was going to be apparently the Stars and Bars, just the regular one. Quite a confusing lineup, if I gotta say so myself, but that was the initial idea and proposal. Now, where did this flag actually come from? Where did the inspiration? Well, apparently Miles, who, crafted the design of the Confederate flag, or at least what would eventually become the Confederate flag, was actually inspired by one of the many secessionist flags that were flown during the South Carolina Secession Convention at the end of 1860. And there was a flag that was inspired by the St. George Cross that had kind of a weird design to it. It was like a blue background, red cross to it with 15 stars on the cross, which represented all the slave-holding states in the United States. Miles kind of took feedback from the design, but also some of the critiques, and tweaked it and changed it into the kind of diagonal diamond design that would eventually become the Confederate battle flag, and also, I believe, flipped some of the colors. So yeah, it's kind of a weird and interesting, little thing. And also, apparently, the cross, which came from the Scotland flag and the initial South Carolina secessionist flag, was rejected because apparently it didn't represent Southern values, which is an interesting little tidbit there. But eventually the flag was adopted when Joseph, by the time in the end of 1861, by this point, Robert E. Lee went on to command the army that would eventually be called the Army of Northern Virginia. And these battle flags were given to the army and basically be used as the symbol of the Confederate force initially fighting in Virginia, but would spread to all of the Confederate armed forces in the rebellion. Now, the interesting flag and the differences to it are very fascinating. The battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia looked more, I guess you can call it more square-like. This was apparently done to Joseph E. Johnston's recommendations when the flag was being designed and adopted. Apparently, it was designed to save cloth, so the rectangular look of it actually wasn't officially adopted in the Army of Northern Virginia. I believe that was officially adopted in the Army of the Tennessee, which Joseph E. Johnston would actually later command, and he would actually take the design that he helped incorporate and bring it into that. And just in general, it just became a very popular, widely used symbol in the Confederacy, especially amongst the Confederate armed forces. Like I said, the design looks very different. And, even though I don't like what the flag represents, right, I do think from a flag standpoint of view, so to speak, it does look pretty cool as a flag. But obviously, I don't like this flag because it represents slavery, at least in my opinion. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting little side point there. It was also used by the Navy as well. Fun fact. Now, this gives some very interesting context to what became known as the second official Confederate flag. I had to talk about the more popular battle flag of the Confederacy that was becoming widely used by many of the armies in the Confederacy. This leads into what eventually became the second official government flag of the Confederacy that would become known as the stainless banner. As you can see, it's a radically different design from the stars and bars. This time around, it was adopted, I believe, in mid-1863 and was used pretty much all the way up to nearly the end of the Civil War. And this flag has shown up in a few paintings, a few movies. It's used here and there, and it is more historically accurate if this flag was definitely used. And yeah, it looks very different. On the top left, where the stars originally were, they put in place the Confederate battle flag, more similar to the square-like design that was mainly used by the Army of Northern Virginia. Regardless, obviously, it shows that this flag was widely being used, and they decided to incorporate it in the national flag. And the rest of the flag would be just have a very much clean, white area to it, nothing to it. Apparently, while the origin of this flag is a bit unknown, it was propagated by many editors in the Confederacy. One editor in particular of the Savannah Morning News in 1863, before the flag was officially adopted, by the way, published his thoughts on the flag. And it's kind of hinted that he maybe, helped design it or give comments on it. But he described the white background and the purpose behind the stainless banner, so to speak. It was basically supposed to represent to him the white man's flag. He explained that the white represented as something, as he said, quote, "As a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-enduring supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would just be emblematical to our cause." And, it's a very crazy way to look at it and a very racist way to look at it, but there was kind of the general view of it. Now, while initially the Confederate Congress wanted to adopt this flag, there was also many calls within the Confederate Congress and states to add sort of a kind of a blue and kind of interesting differences to it, maybe add a stripe to it. And initially this was done. They were going to employ this flag with a blue stripe on it, but eventually other supporters, including William Miles as well, which I mentioned earlier, he argued that the battle flag must be used, but also have a plain white field to make it as simply as possible. And he campaigned against having a blue bar added on it, which apparently would have ran on the center of the white field, which would have looked very strange and weird to his design. But eventually, of course, it was adopted in May of 1863. It was actually used first officially on the funeral for the General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. It was actually put over his grave and tombs and grave, or not grave, excuse me, but his casket. And it was kind of nicknamed as the Stonewall flag or the Jackson flag. But, this flag, while it definitely fixed a lot of things logistically, and it fixed some big issues with the last flag, I am kind of perplexed on why the Confederate Congress didn't just simply adapt the battle flag as the official governmental flag. Simply since, it looks very different from the United States, and in general, it just kind of, in my opinion, looks like a better flag. But there was many problems that would soon arise from what would be called a stainless manner, and it would become really big as the Civil War went along, especially since this flag was being flown during battles, and battles filled with smoke, and eventually the late 1864, different time period when the Army of Northern Virginia was being put in trenches against the Union Army. This flag would, basically, the stainless banner would start to fade. It would slowly wither in design a little bit. And as time went along, it started to look more like a surrender flag. The Confederate battle flag, part of it would start to fade and would look more like a surrender flag, which is very bad for your rebellion, especially if you're not trying to surrender. But from the distance, this flag looked more like a surrender flag, and of course created more confusion on the battlefield. Once again, totally perplexed on why the Confederate government just didn't adopt the widely used battle flag. It just made more sense. Eventually, we lead to the third and final official government flag that was used by the rebellion, the Confederate States. That is, of course, the so-called blood-stained banner. Now, this was adopted in March of 1865, but by that point, it really didn't matter. The Confederacy was on its last legs. Union armies were well deep inside Confederate territory. Sherman had already made his march through Georgia, was already up through, South Carolina, was starting to go up towards Virginia. Grant was just at that point about to break the siege on Petersburg against Robert E. Lee's army. So it really didn't matter. But yeah, like I said, the Confederate Congress passed the Flag Act of 1865. This was used to address some of the big criticisms of the last flag, because I already mentioned, during the battles, the flag would be faded. It would look more like a surrender flag. So they decided to kind of go with more of their original proposal and decided to add a red stripe to it. Now, they didn't choose a blue stripe this time because they didn't want anything blue on the flag, mainly because that would represent Yankees and Unionists. And, of course, we're Confederates, so we don't want anything like that on our flag. So they added a big red banner to the right of it. They also kind of formatted the flag all weird. The formatting on the last flag, I forgot to mention, was very weird. But especially on this flag, it just looks really strange. Like the top left Confederate battle flag part of it looks a bit too big. The banner looks, the red banner on the other side of it looks a bit too weird. It just looks weirdly and bad formatted. But that being said, this flag wasn't really used at the end of the Civil War. Due to the timing when this flag was adopted, there was very few of these third version of the national flags ever produced. Like I said before, they never really made it to the battlefield, as apparently soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia never even saw this flag. There was apparently some made by the Richmond Clothing Depot, and they were kind of just stored there, apparently. But, most of them weren't really being released to most Confederate armed forces, because by this point it was March of 1865. It was the end of the war. I mean, by April of 1865, Richmond would be overtaken by the Federals. Robert E. Lee's army later on in April would surrender his forces to Grant, and eventually Joe Johnston's army would do the same. And it just in general, by May, the Confederate government was dissolved. So like I said, this third flag really didn't mean anything. But yeah, that's basically what happened. And yeah, that was all of the official governmental state, not state flags, but all the government flags that were used by the Confederate States of America. I also talked about the battle flag that was mainly widely used by the Confederate Armed Forces. And my thoughts on all these flags. It is basically a very wild turn of events just to kind of look at all these flags. It's a very much there's many design choices on these flags don't make a lot of sense. You go from a flag that looked very similar to the United States, people complain about that. Then a battle flag that was becoming widely used by the Confederate Armed Forces. They take elements of that, they put it in a stainless white flag. But that flag was like a surrender flag, and then they eventually fixed it by putting a kind of ugly red banner on the right side. But, it's kind of strange, right? Especially strange how they just didn't adopt the Confederate battle flag as their official Confederacy government flag. It's very weird, and it's just very strange. Of course, I don't like any of these flags from a purely design... Like, I do like some of these flags from a purely design point of view, mainly just the battle flag. All these other flags, to me personally, don't look that great. I mean, the stars and bars to me looks okay, but the other flags definitely have a lot to improve upon. But of course, I'm not going to be flying any of these flags because I don't like what they represent. To me, especially, of course, now in these days with the internet and in general taking down of Confederate monuments and kind of also the debunking of the lost cause. In general, I just kind of don't like these flags from what they represent. You're not going to catch me flying a Confederate flag on my lawn because they represent slavery. They represent a period of time that was very different from the United States. They represent an institution I'm sure most common people would be against. Hopefully most people are against slavery. So yeah, but like I said, just wanted to make a very quick video to kind of go over a little bit of history and my thoughts on the Confederate States of America's government flags and the battle flag. Hopefully you all have a good day, and peace, yo.